In the autumn of 1898, a fire burned in the hills of Fleming County, Kentucky, that was not meant to warm a home or cook a meal. It was a fire of judgment, of superstition, and of death, and when the smoke cleared, a woman named Margaret Ervine had been reduced to ash and bone, a sacrifice to a terror that had gripped a mountain community for years. But the fire was not the end of the story. It was merely the opening chapter of a mystery that would remain unsolved for generations, a tale of witchcraft, violence, and the dark heart of Appalachian folklore. The story of Margaret Ervine is a story that has been passed down through the families of Fleming County, a story that most outsiders have never heard, a story that reveals the terrifying power of belief and the terrible things that can happen when a community turns against one of its own. Fleming County lies in the rolling hills of northeastern Kentucky, a region of narrow valleys and forested ridges that has been home to the same families for generations. The county was founded in 1798, named for Colonel John Fleming, a surveyor and soldier who had fought in the Revolutionary War. The first settlers were mostly of Scots-Irish descent, hardy people who had come to the mountains seeking land, independence, and a new life. They built their cabins in the hollows, farmed the thin soil, and raised their families in a world that was isolated, self-sufficient, and deeply steeped in tradition. By the late 19th century, Fleming County was a place of small farms and small towns. The county seat of Flemingsburg was a bustling community of perhaps 1,000 people, with a courthouse, a jail, a few churches, and a newspaper. But the real life of the county was in the hills, in the hollows, in the cabins that were scattered along the creeks and the ridges. It was a world that was both beautiful and brutal. The mountain people lived close to the land, and they lived close to the edge of survival. Disease, accident, and violence were constant threats, and death was a familiar visitor. In a world where so much was beyond their control, the people of Fleming County sought meaning and explanation in the traditions of their ancestors, in the folk beliefs that had crossed the ocean with their forebears. And one of those beliefs was the belief in witchcraft. The Scots-Irish who had settled Appalachia had brought with them a deep and abiding belief in the supernatural. They believed in witches, in curses, in the power of the evil eye. They believed that a person could be bewitched, that a spell could bring sickness, death, or misfortune. And they believed that witches had to be dealt with, by force if necessary. In the mountains, the belief in witchcraft was not a superstition, it was a fact of life. It was a way of explaining the inexplicable, of giving meaning to tragedy, of providing a target for the fear and anger that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. And it was a belief that had very real consequences. Margaret Ervine was a widow who lived in a cabin in a hollow known locally as Rolf's Hollow, a narrow valley that cut deep into the hills of Fleming County. She was a woman of about 60, with gray hair and a lined face, the face of a woman who had worked hard all her life. She had been born in the mountains, had married a man named James Ervine, and had raised a family of children. But James had died, and Margaret had been left alone. She was a strange woman, by the standards of the community. She kept to herself, rarely visiting her neighbors or attending the local church. She was known to wander the hills at odd hours, gathering herbs and roots, which she would use to make medicines for herself and for anyone who asked. She knew the old ways, the ways of the mountain healers, the ways of the charm doctors who had been a part of Appalachian culture since the earliest days of settlement. But in a world where fear and suspicion were as common as the mountain mist, Margaret Ervine's eccentricities were a source of unease. Her neighbors whispered that she was more than a healer. They whispered that she was a witch. The rumors had been circulating for years. A cow that gave sour milk, a horse that went lame, a child who fell ill, all of these misfortunes were blamed on Margaret Ervine. Her neighbors claimed she had cursed them, that she had put the evil eye on them, that she had been seen dancing in the moonlight, calling upon the devil. There was no evidence, no proof. But in the world of Appalachian folklore, proof was not required. Belief was enough. And in 1898, that belief would erupt into violence. In the autumn of that year, a series of misfortunes struck the families of Rolf's Hollow. A neighbor's cow died suddenly, with no apparent cause. A hog was found slaughtered, its throat cut, but no predator was responsible. A child fell ill with a mysterious fever, and the doctor could offer no cure. A fire burned down a barn, and the cause was unknown. The people of the hollow were terrified. They knew who was responsible for their misfortunes. It was Margaret Ervine. She was a witch, and she was cursing them, and something had to be done. But what could be done? The law would not help. The sheriff would not arrest a woman for being a witch. The courts would not try her. The people of the Hollow would have to take matters into their own hands. The local historian, Daniel Rolfe, would later record the story of what happened next. According to the oral tradition, a group of men from the Hollow gathered at a cabin one night, a secret meeting to discuss what was to be done about Margaret Ervine. They were angry, they were scared, and they were determined to end the curse that had been plaguing them. The men decided that Margaret Ervine had to be forced to leave. They would go to her cabin, they would drag her out, and they would order her to leave the Hollow and never return. If she refused, they would use force. On a cold evening in October 1898, a group of masked men approached Margaret Ervine's cabin. They surrounded the small house, their faces hidden by kerchiefs or hoods, their intention clear. They were a mob, and they were there to deliver a message. The leader of the mob, a man known only by the name Browning, pounded on the door. Margaret Ervine answered, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She knew why they had come. "Witch," Browning said, his voice low and menacing. "We've come to tell you to leave. Get out of this hollow and never come back. If we ever see you again, we will not be so gentle." The threat was clear. They would kill her if she didn't leave. But Margaret Ervine was a stubborn woman. She refused to be intimidated by a band of masked men. She had lived in the Hollow for all of her life, and she had nowhere else to go. "I will not leave," she said. "This is my home. I have done nothing to you. I have cursed no one. I have only tried to help." The mob was not swayed by her arguments. They had made up their minds. She was a witch, and she had to be dealt with. Browning grabbed Margaret by the arm and dragged her out of the cabin. She was shoved into a cart, and the mob began to haul her out of the Hollow, away from her home, away from the life she had known. But the mob was not content with merely banishing her. A rage had taken hold of them. They had been victimized by her witchcraft, and they wanted revenge. As the cart reached a clearing, they stopped. "Burn her," someone shouted. "Burn the witch." The mob built a pyre of dry wood and brush. They dragged Margaret Ervine from the cart and tied her to a stake. She pleaded with them, begged for mercy, swore on the Bible that she was not a witch. But the mob was beyond reason. They had been driven by fear and anger, and they were determined to see it through. One of the men lit a torch and held it to the wood. The fire began to catch, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. The flames licked at the wood, growing higher and higher, until they reached Margaret Ervine. The memory of her death, as recorded by local historian Daniel Rolfe, is a haunting one. According to family traditions gathered in to shoot, burn, and hang, the old-timers in Rolfe's Hollow would later describe the woman's screams as unearthly and like a mountain cat in a trap. These were not the screams of a person dying a natural death, but something else, something animal-like and primal, sounds that no one who heard them would ever forget. The fire consumed her, and when it was done, there was nothing left but ash and bone. The mob dispersed, believing that they had done the right thing, that they had rid the community of the evil that had been plaguing it. They returned to their homes, and they told themselves that the matter was settled. But it was not settled. The killing of Margaret Ervine would haunt the community for decades. It would become a story that was told and retold, a legend that would be passed down through the generations. And it would become a mystery that would eventually be investigated by a scholar who wanted to know the truth. The investigation into the death of Margaret Ervine did not begin until nearly a century later. In the 1980s, a folklorist and historian named Daniel Rolfe began collecting the oral traditions of his family in Fleming County. He had grown up hearing the story of the witch, the story of the fire, the story of the woman who had been burned in the Hollow. And he began to wonder, was the story true? Rolfe collected accounts from his family members, asking them to tell him what they knew about the killing of Margaret Ervine. He recorded their stories, their memories, and their suspicions. He sought out old newspaper accounts and courthouse records. He spent years piecing together the fragments of the past. What he found was a story of a community in the grip of fear, a story of a woman who had been made into a scapegoat, a story of a murder that had been allowed to go unpunished. Rolfe's investigation was not a simple one. The story had been passed down through the generations, and it had been changed and embellished along the way. The witnesses had died, the evidence had vanished, and the truth had become a tangle of rumor, tradition, and folklore. But Rolfe was able to confirm several key details. He discovered that Margaret Ervine had indeed lived in Fleming County, that she had been a widow, and that she had died in the autumn of 1898. The death had been recorded as a natural death, with no mention of a fire, no mention of a mob, no mention of witchcraft. The cover-up had been effective. The community had conspired to keep the truth hidden. The killing of Margaret Ervine was a secret that had been buried for generations. But secrets have a way of surfacing. And Rolfe was determined to bring this one to light. The story of Margaret Ervine is not unique. It is a story that has been repeated countless times in the hills of Appalachia. In a world where fear and superstition were the currency of everyday life, women who were seen as different, women who were seen as powerful, women who were seen as a threat to the established order, were often accused of witchcraft. The belief in witchcraft was a powerful force in Appalachian culture. It was a way of explaining the inexplicable, a way of giving meaning to tragedy, and a way of providing a target for the fear and anger that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. The tradition of the charm doctor was an accepted part of Appalachian society, but it was a profession that was fraught with danger. Women who were known as healers, as wise women, as witches, walked a fine line. They were sought after for their knowledge and their power, but they were also feared and suspected. In times of crisis, the suspicion could turn to violence. The community could turn on the healer, blaming her for the misfortunes that had befallen them. The fear that she had been a source of evil could lead to accusations of witchcraft, and accusations of witchcraft could lead to death. The women who were accused of witchcraft were often those who did not fit in. They were unmarried, widowed, or otherwise outside the normal structures of community life. They were seen as a threat to the established order, a source of chaos in a world that demanded conformity. The story of Margaret Ervine is a story of this pattern. She was a widow, a healer, a woman who lived on her own terms. She was feared and suspected, and in the end, she was killed for the crime of being different. But the investigation into Margaret Ervine's death reveals an even darker truth. According to the oral traditions collected by Daniel Rolfe, there was more to the killing than just a simple belief in witchcraft. The mob that had killed her was not acting out of pure superstition, it was also acting out of a desire to conceal a deeper secret. The death of Margaret Ervine was connected to another tragedy that had struck the community. A local family, the Ervines, had been involved in a series of misfortunes, including the death of a child and the destruction of a barn. The community believed that the Ervines had been cursed by the witch, and the witch had to be killed to lift the curse. But there was more to the story than that. The Ervines themselves had been involved in questionable activities. They had been involved in the illegal whiskey trade, and they had made enemies in the community. The witch hunt was a way of diverting attention from their own crimes, a way of creating a scapegoat to be sacrificed for the sake of the community. The killing of Margaret Ervine was not just an act of superstition. It was an act of manipulation, a conspiracy to conceal a deeper crime. The community had turned on an innocent woman to protect their own. They had allowed a murderer to go free, and they had allowed the truth to be buried. The story of Margaret Ervine is a story of injustice, of violence, and of the power of belief. It is a story of a community that was driven by fear and superstition to commit a terrible crime. It is a story of a woman who was killed for being different, for being feared, for being a threat to the established order. And it is a story of a truth that was buried for generations, a truth that was finally uncovered by a scholar who was determined to find it. But the story is also a reminder of the fragility of justice in the face of fear. In a world where a community can turn on an individual and kill them without consequence, the rule of law is meaningless. The killing of Margaret Ervine was a lynching, a crime that was allowed to go unpunished because the community refused to acknowledge what had happened. The cover-up was effective. The death was recorded as a natural death, and the killers were never brought to justice. The truth was hidden for generations, hidden in the stories that were told around the campfires, hidden in the whispers of the old-timers, hidden in the silence of those who knew what had happened. It is a tragedy that has been repeated countless times in American history, a tragedy that speaks to the darkest impulses of the human heart. In the end, the story of Margaret Ervine is a story of a question that remains unanswered. What happened to the Witch of Rolf's Hollow? Why was she killed? Who were the men who burned her? And why did the community allow them to go free? These are questions that may never be answered. The witnesses are dead, the evidence is gone, and the truth is buried in the memories of a community that has long since moved on. But the story of Margaret Ervine is still told. It is told by the descendants of those who knew her, the descendants of those who killed her, and the descendants of those who kept the secret. It is a story that lingers in the hills of Fleming County, a ghost that haunts the hollows, a reminder of a dark time when a woman could be killed for the crime of being a witch. The memory of Margaret Ervine is a reminder of a pattern that has been repeated countless times in American history. It is the pattern of the scapegoat, the pattern of the outsider, the pattern of the woman who is feared and hated because she is different, and it is a pattern that continues to manifest in countless ways in our own time. The story of Margaret Ervine is also a reminder of the power of belief. In the hills of Appalachia, the belief in witchcraft was not a mere superstition, but a deeply held conviction. It was a way of understanding the world, a way of explaining the inexplicable, and a way of making sense of a life that was often brutal and short. In the end, the story of Margaret Ervine is a story of a tragedy that was born of belief, of a community that was driven by fear, and of a woman who was killed for being a witch. The question that haunts the hills of Fleming County is this: what else did the community believe about witches that might still be true? What other secrets are buried in the hollows of Appalachia, and what will it take to unearth them? The truth is out there, buried in the memories, hidden in the stories. And one day, perhaps, it will be brought to light. But for now, the tale of the Witch of Rolf's Hollow remains a lingering mystery, a chilling echo of a past that refuses to be forgotten.